But basically, shortest gospel. I mean, to think about it, this gospel is almost half the size of Luke. So to give you a picture of how condensed this is, Mark's writing is really very economical, I think would be the way I would put it. He doesn't embellish a lot, but he does tell us really interesting stories. He tells us interesting things about what Jesus teaches and how he teaches. Of all of the Gospels, when Jesus begins to teach in parables, he makes commentary, right, about why he's using parables. That's not in Matthew or Luke. So it was important for Mark, I think, as the first one, to explain some of these things to us. So I love that, and I love, frankly, I love how much the disciples don't get it in Mark, because that makes me feel a little less stupid. So, right off the bat, right, chapter 1, verse 1, this is the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. That's the first verse. So Mark is being incredibly transparent about what he's up to. He wants us to know that Jesus is the Son of God. The narrative starts in Galilee, actually at the river ministry of John the Baptist, out in the Central Valley there. And then goes north, and it's in Galilee, the entire gospel until Jesus goes to Jerusalem. That's interesting. None of the other gospels are presented that way. It begins with the ministry of John the Baptist, and then right off the bat we have sort of this new, what I want to call the new king. So I've got three divisions of threes. So what I have here is the new king, chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 3, verse 6. And right off the bat, Jesus is dismantling the devil's work. I mean, he is casting out demons every time he goes anywhere. It seems like he casts out demons as much as he heals people. His preaching is organized into sermons, brief messages, attended by his being a miracle worker. You go to the north shore of Galilee, and the first place I take people is up to the Cliffs of Arbel. Because at the Cliffs of Arbel, which is now a national park, we used to literally climb over fences and go through fields to get up to that overlook, and now buses go up there. I started in 1996 going there, and my last trip that I led was 2019. And I always take people up there because I say, see this? And you can see right there the 7 miles that are the north shore of the Sea of Galilee. This is where Jesus spent 3 years. So if you're here in Magdala, and it takes you about 5 minutes to walk over to where we think loaves and fishes were, the idea that Jesus did something in one of these little villages and the word spread throughout the region, it's super easy to imagine, right? Because it's all right there. So if something like that is happening, if a paralyzed person is suddenly healed, you can bet the whole north shore of Galilee knows about it within a day and a half, right? It's not hard to picture that. So a lot of the way Mark writes about, and immediately, and this happened, and then this happened, and it all seems to be happening so quickly, it's happening within 7 miles. Now Jesus makes a few small forays out of the area, but 90% of what he's doing is right there with these villages. From Magdala on the one side to Kursi on the other. So the new king, and what happens at the end of that section? It says the Jewish leaders rejected him and began to plan his murder. So these little red dots in here are when the opposition shows up, right? And again, isn't it interesting that Mark writes this section and then there's this comment about people are not going for Jesus, all right? The new kingdom is where Jesus calls the 12 apostles, and he teaches the parables of the kingdom of God in the 4th chapter. So that goes 3:7 to 6:6. And at the end of that, his hometown, Nazareth, says, no way. We knew you growing up. You're Mary and Joseph's kid. You know, this doesn't square who we know you to be and who you're claiming to be. And then a variety of things happens here. Jesus walks on water. Jesus has 2 feeding of the multitudes. Did that surprise you? You all knew that there was a feeding of 4,000 and a feeding of 5,000? And then he starts to talk about his understanding of the Jewish law. And in this way, I think Mark is presenting him as the new Moses. And that section ends with Jesus saying to the disciples, don't you get it? And we don't have any reply there, but it's a rhetorical question begging the answer no. Then this is very interesting. The next section, which is the 3 times Jesus says, I'm going to Jerusalem, I'm going to suffer and die, and on the 3rd day I'm going to rise again. You know, you've already heard that in preaching here in the last few weeks. There's 3 instances in which Jesus predicts his death and resurrection. And in each of these sections, we get some information, and then we also get some conclusions, right? But what precedes this section? The healing of a blind man. Very interesting. Because again, when the disciples are not getting it, Jesus is healing somebody who's blind and they see. You see, I think what Mark is doing there, he's working on that. And a similar thing happens here. Where does this section end? The healing of blind Barnabas. And we had it well illustrated this morning in the children's sermon. This guy is insistent. He is not taking no for an answer. He wants to see. And nobody's going to be able to talk him out of trying to see, right? I mean, that's quite a scene. I love his character. And again, in comparison to the disciples who just increasingly don't get it. So the first prediction is where Peter says, you're the Messiah. I believe you're the Messiah. And then Jesus' response to that is, you need to take up your cross and follow me if you want to be my follower. The next one, he says, again, I'm going to die. And then he talks about the first being last. We remember the story of the rich young man who came, and Jesus makes comment about their stopping infighting. And then that ends with Jesus saying, any one of you who's given up anything, you'll get it back 100 times in this life, he says, which I'm really curious about. He's not saying when you die and go to heaven. He says, in this life 100 times. Well, where have we heard 100 times before? Anybody remember? Parable of the sower. Right? So what he's saying here goes back to the parable of the sower here, where it's like seed is thrown out, and the seed that goes on to good ground returns 40, 60, 100-fold, right? And I think what Jesus is talking about here, and what Jesus is talking about in the parable of the sower, same thing. So those 2 things, to me at least, line up. And then the final time, and by the way, at the end of this one, we have the transfiguration. So the voice comes from heaven, this is my son, listen to him, right? Here we have that comment about how can it be that rich people aren't going to be saved? And Jesus says, nobody having given up anything will not receive 100 times in this life and in the world to come. And then this third time, he concludes with the greatest in the kingdom is slave of all. And this is after he says the Son did not come to be served, but to serve, and James and John come and make their request. You remember that? Sermon 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago? Then we get to this section. And if you read Isaiah 53, which is the great passage in the prophet Isaiah of the suffering servant of God who's going to come, I believe Isaiah was picturing a coming king who was going to be a suffering servant, which squares up with everything Jesus says about himself coming not to be served but to serve. But does anybody know, who do Jewish people today say is the suffering servant when they read Isaiah 53? Do you know? I've asked several rabbis, always the same answer. The Jews. The Jews are the ones who've suffered. The Jews are the ones who have undergone so much, tragedy. And the Holocaust being the ultimate proof, right? So when you read that passage and you see something like Mark being written and you think, how does a Jew look at that passage and see what Mark is doing with it and say, oh, that doesn't make any sense to me? It's because they have, since the destruction of Jerusalem, defined Isaiah 53 to describe themselves. That's fascinating to me. You know, and to some extent it makes logical sense. I don't want to quibble with their saying, no, that's us, right? So, if you look at Isaiah 53 and how it's outlined, it's almost exactly the way Mark describes Jesus as the suffering servant in these 4 chapters. So 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, so 5 chapters. So the first chapter is about Jesus as the Messiah as king. The second one is about Messiah as lawgiver, a lawgiver like Moses. The third is Jesus as prophet. When you were reading Mark, I'm assuming you have, and I'm not going to ask you for who did, who didn't, but if you had a chance to read Mark, you come to the 13th chapter of Mark, and it's an apocalypse, right? It's an entire chapter on the second coming. We have it in Matthew 24, we have it in Luke 21, by the way. So again, if you really are interested in the book of Revelation, I am, and all those things, you actually have a whole chapter in all 3 Gospels where Jesus talks about his view of the end time. That's fascinating. So, and again, I see that as Jesus fulfilling the role of the Messiah being prophet. And then, when he talks about sacrifice in Mark, it's at the Lord's Supper. This is my body given for you. This is my blood shed for you. So, this picture of Jesus as the suffering servant, that's Mark. None of the others do that. But Mark wants to make a direct connection between the Isaiah 53 prophecy and Jesus. Okay? Then we get to this narrative of a chapter and a half, and everything goes wrong. One of the original 12 that we would never suspect ends up being the betrayer. The disciples split. They just run. Again, my question mark is it true that a lot of what Mark got was from Peter, and what we know is Peter split and never came back? And again, John tells us the story of how did that all work out. Because you remember the 3 times Jesus says to Peter, do you love me? That's to undo this. But do you notice, it's interesting, Jesus has 3 times said, here's what's going to happen to me, and 3 times Peter denies him. I see those things in Mark, isn't it? And then Jesus is accused, the Jews accuse him, and Rome kills him. Exactly what he predicted in the 3rd telling of what was going to happen to him next. And irony of ironies, if you please, who is it that recognizes Jesus as the Son of God? Peter. Peter recognizes him as the Messiah, back here. But it's at the cross that a Roman centurion observing, quote, how Jesus died, Mark writes, exclaims, truly this man was the Son of God. So it's an outsider, it's a Gentile, it's a Roman who comes to the right conclusion. That's, I don't know, seems like it to me. And then we have...
They didn't even believe in a single God.
No, except, centurions were around. Centurions got people healed. There were Roman soldiers at John the Baptist.
Well, the centurion's son.
Right, different one, but yes.
He's we assume it's a different one.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
But anyway, that is quite a feature in Mark, that the one person who gets it in the end is this Roman centurion who's observed his death. Again, the death being the thing, right? Then we have the curious thing that happens in Mark 16, where we've got this really short 8-verse telling of the Easter story. I don't know about you, it feels a little unsatisfactory. The end conclusion is, okay, Jesus is not there. It's clear. Body's gone, at least. And the disciples are just confused and bewildered. So the question mark that comes here is when the angel is said, go and tell, and they end up just being afraid, are they going to go and tell? I mean, that's how it ends, which is, I mean, Mark, I think, in a way, at his best. But we have this later material, right? And there's some pretty, I don't know, fantastic stuff in Mark 16. This is the, you will drink any deadly thing and it won't harm you. You will be bitten by poisonous snakes and they won't hurt you. I mean, the stuff that's in the end of Mark 16 is really like, wow. And I personally can come to only one conclusion, because it's clearly added in the 2nd or 3rd century. And I'm going to argue, I did actually in the paper I wrote, I'm going to argue that those things were still happening in the 2nd and 3rd century, or they would have never included those things in the gospel at that time. So the miraculous stuff that we see in the book of Acts continued happening. And we know the charismatic church lasts well into the 3rd century. What happens in the 3rd century?
The church split.
Constantine suddenly announces this religion now is the official religion of the empire. And a lot of the real, what I would call grassroots stuff that was the early church gets swallowed up by an institution. That's also when they started wearing robes, which is one of the reasons I'm not crazy about wearing them. So, any questions about Mark or that? Or, I mean, what's your reaction after having read it? And I also appreciate that. I know it's hard as we get older to read.
Kind of read like Cliff Notes, because it was one after another, after another, after another, you know.
It's
all the
fast.
miracles and then compare everything, just boom, boom.
Yeah. They say that, you read Mark's Gospel and you're out of breath at the end because it just goes.
Well, I had never read Mark's Gospel.
Okay.
And I certainly had never read it in its entirety. And what Jim and I both said was, wow, here it is. This is where all those miracles are. And those are the kind of exciting things, and they're all in one place.
Yep.
So now if I ever want to bring one up, I know where to look.
Yeah.
And I didn't before.
That's good. That's what I'm hoping for. So what's your general impression of Jesus when all is said and done with this book?
Why did he keep telling people not to say anything?
Yeah, that was my question too.
So I think, and I don't know, but I think Mark is indicating that there is this, from the beginning, a growing opposition, and the faster his fame spreads, the shorter his time is going to be. And so my sense is that the way Mark is telling the story is he's asking the disciples to keep it on the down low so that he has as much time as he could possibly have. That's my sense. But in Mark, it seems as if Jesus is just trying to keep on going as long as he can. But what happens there that's so incredible in the 8th chapter is he's now leaving Galilee, and that entire central column is his journey from Galilee to Jerusalem. All these events take place as he's winding his way to Jerusalem with the expectation that he's going to be executed. But it's before that, it's in that first column where Jesus continually says, please keep this quiet. And then once he admits to Peter that he is the Messiah, then it seems to be removed. I don't think there's a place in there where Jesus says that again. Done.
What's the relationship between the Jews and Rome? It says the Jews accuse and Rome kills. Did the Jews compel, or?
Well, we have fuller, stories of how this all played out with Pilate and everything else. But clearly the religious authorities wanted him dead. There is a sense in which you remember that the way the governor tried to be magnanimous was he would say to them, okay, I'm going to let one person go free for this holiday that you have of freedom. Who would you like? And given the choice of Jesus and Barabbas, they choose Barabbas, right? So, and again, you have to remember that the greatest value that somebody like Herod has, particularly, is keeping the peace. There are over 200 to 400, there's two different counts, people crucified on Golgotha and the surrounding roads 2 weeks before Jesus is killed. So this was what Rome did whenever they were coming up on a time that there were going to be all these people coming into the city. They made a very clear statement. If you cause trouble or mess with us, we will kill you. And they did. And that's why especially the zealot group was just getting taken out, and they really stayed underground. So I hope this is helpful. It's a lot to take in, but I would say the highlights to me of this are especially this piece. I mean, this is the thing that you will hear said so often, is that Mark literally lays out the events of Jesus' passion to the events as they are listed in the prophecy in Isaiah. Because in Mark's mind, he sees Isaiah and he just sees this as such a prophecy. What's the other one? Do you know off the top of your heads? What's the other place where you read in the scriptures and you think to yourself, oh my goodness, this is word for word? The 22nd Psalm. You read the 22nd Psalm and it's like, you know, that's the one that says my bones, you know, are kept intact and all that. And it's like, wow. It's another place where it's just kind of stunning how accurately it describes Jesus' death.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
How about this fig tree? What's his problem with the fig tree? And I don't follow the lesson. It just seems kind of arbitrary and petty.
Fig tree was the national symbol of Israel.
I was amazed reading this, how closely this follows the script for The Chosen. I mean, I could visually see, scene by scene by scene, but the guy...
And remember, this is the outline that is used by Matthew and Luke.
Yeah,
So the
yeah,
synoptics really are
Yeah.
very close
Yeah.
with detail. So the order in which things take place, and it's fascinating to me, Luke says, okay, I'm going to do the research and I'm going to get the order right.
Yeah.
And it keeps it.
Yeah.
With a great expansion. I mean, a tremendous expansion. But no, I'm not surprised.
So Mark was the person that went with Paul on the journey and got kicked out.
Right?
Okay.
He also, in Peter's epistle, he says that he was a companion for Peter to Rome. And so Mark is around. And if you believe my kind of goofy little theory that guy who runs off in the garden naked is Mark. Mark, at some point in time, between this point and here, has renounced his wealth and come and follow Jesus. Must have come someday and say, remember me? I'm the guy who you said give away everything you did. I did. I'm here now.
I think that's very credible, because when I didn't know until I read it, and I go, why is that even in here?
It's a
What
goofy
is that?
story.
Yeah.
It makes no sense to include it unless it's an
Put your
autograph.
initials. Yep,
Yeah.
yep,
Yeah.
yep.
Isn't that fun?
Yeah.
So you think that the rich man who refused to give up his stuff and follow Jesus is Mark, and he finally said, okay, I see the light? Ah, okay.
It says he went away sad.
Yeah.
That's all. It doesn't say he went away and never came back.
Nope. And I still think it's interesting, only Mark says Jesus looked at the young man with love in his eyes. It's the only one who says that.
Yeah.
That's an interesting detail.
He's the one who saw the light.
Yeah. Which is what made him not able to, in the end, follow.
You know, I think that's the hundredfold that we're talking about.
Huh?
Is, you know, people that take care of other people basically give away their wealth. You know, they end up with lots of friends and people who love them and everything. And that's a blessing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Lois, could I twist your arm to pray for us? Yeah. Would you?
Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for this time together. Learn more about you and your word. Be with us in our daily life. and help us to live the way you would have us live. I love you, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen. Can't pray better than that.